Okay, Brent, I'm back on.
Hi, Wayne. Yeah, we're going to get started in a second here. I'm just going to actually mute you for a second, Wayne, while I do the introduction, and then I'll turn your mic back on.
Okay, that'll be fine.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the final Forest Health webinar of the year from Southern Regional Extension Forestry's Forest Health program. Unfortunately, Dr. Dave Coyle, who runs the program, couldn't actually be here today, so I'm substituting in for him. My name is Brent Peterson. I also work with Southern Regional Extension Forestry, and I work on the Forest Health program as well. So, as you can see, there are a bunch of resources on the webinar portal that you all can access on this slide. And under the related files, you can download and print the slides from today's webinar and make notes if you wish. So today, we are actually going to be talking about hardwood forest management for health and productivity. It's going to be about an hour long. And if you have any sort of problems throughout with the audio setup, please hit this button. You can see the little arrow pointing to that there. It'll allow you to ensure that your audio is set up properly. And of course, I should mention that all of the messages in the chat are supervised. So the presenter and the moderator can see all the messages. So, you could say nasty things to each other about us, but we'll know and probably be sad. If anybody wants continuing education credits today, y'all are going to need to complete the satisfaction survey and take and pass a short quiz, in addition to completing and returning the continuing education unit request form. So I will actually put the link out to this at the end of the webinar, so don't worry about that. That will be on me to show you. And if you have any questions after the webinar, please contact Dr. Dave Coyle. He at dcoyle@sref.info. He is the true coordinator of the Forest Health and Invasive Species Program. I am just a sub. All right. So today we have with us Dr. Wayne Clatterbuck. Dr. Wayne Clatterbuck is professor of silviculture and forest management at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville and part of the Forestry Extension team. Today, Dr. Clatterbuck will discuss hardwood management strategies to maintain healthy and productive forests with a focus on the southeastern United States. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Clatterbuck.
Well, hello, everybody. Glad you're here. I'm glad there's a lot of folks here interested in hardwoods, which is my forte. So glad you're taking time out of your busy schedule today. Just a little bit about myself. I work with the University of Tennessee in Extension. I have a wonderful job. I get to work with lots of people and lots of programs. I get to teach a little bit. I get to do a little research. But working with clientele, primarily landowners and professionals, is what I enjoy the most. So hopefully that'll rub off on some of you today. Forest health has gotten to be a buzzword, and more importantly, it needs to be a buzzword to get folks interested in what it composes a healthy forest. I find out nobody wants a unhealthy forest, but what does compose a healthy forest is very important. So let's sort of get into it and we'll go from there. I'm going to be talking about what is a healthy forest, what are some of the components of a healthy forest, some common conditions we find in hardwood stands. Most of these hardwood stands are unmanaged, and that leads to some health considerations. Promoting stand resistance through management. And then we're going to talk a little bit about invasives. Invasives was something we didn't talk about much 20 years ago, but something that was fortified in me last year when we had our senior class projects, and every presentation, the properties that they were looking at had invasives, and most of our students really didn't know what to do with invasives. It's not part of our curriculum in forestry. So I've taken it upon myself that we're going to take a week in silviculture class just to talk about invasives and control of invasives and so forth. So I wanted to touch on that at the end of the presentation. So what is a healthy forest? I look at it as two distinct areas. It's the ability of a forest to sustain itself ecologically, as well as provide the society what they desire and need. So it has both biology and social aspects associated with it. So ecologically, it's a healthy forest retains its unique species and processes while maintaining its structure, composition, and function. So you can start thinking about ecosystem function. You can start thinking about how species perpetuate themselves and those processes and functions involved. And then socially, a healthy forest has the ability to accommodate human needs, and those needs can be multifaceted. Their values, for products perhaps, for services, maybe just making sure you feel good about your forests. So both the ecology and the social aspects are really interrelated. Forests cannot meet social needs without possessing the sustained capacity to grow, reproduce, recycle, and carry out other ecological functions. I am at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is just a few miles down the road. And they're really having a hard time trying to figure out what a healthy forest is, because typically they're in a preservation mode, and in that preservation mode that they have problems trying to figure out how that would all work together in trying to keep the forest in some state of being the same. So in those kind of situations, forests change over time, and with forests changing over time, they may be changing to something that people may not value as much. I get questions all the time in the Smokies, this is a pristine area. And it's not a pristine area. Most of the Smokies was logged in some form or capacity before it became a national park, and what we're seeing today is a result of that logging. So again, trying to merge those different value systems sometimes is difficult, but something that needs to be looked at. So your indicators of a healthy forest is the capacity of renewal, that forests are renewable, they are sustainable. Can they regenerate and stay in some type of a sustainable pattern? The forests are resilient, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on resiliency. And then are they meeting current and future desires and uses? And that can be most anything. That could be for wildlife, it could be for recreation, could be for clean water or clean air, or for timber. So most of the time, when we're thinking about these desires and uses, it's not a single use, it's a multiple use. And with multiple uses, you do get some conflicts between the uses that you have to address. So the capacity of renewal. We're having problems sometimes regenerating our forests, especially to the desirable species that we have. So we have a couple photos here. Fire, prescribed burning in hardwoods is something that is now being investigated, and we get a lot of folks. I think a lot of people enjoy being pyromaniacs and trying to figure out how was fire in the system originally and how can we use fire as a management tool. And then regeneration, and we are not creating a lot of the conditions to regenerate the forest, to sustain that forest. We have a lot of closed canopies, and those closed canopies do not allow enough sunlight to get to the ground that we get desirable regeneration. And perhaps the regeneration that we get is more of the shade-tolerant species that may not be as desirable as some of the others. So resiliency. This is the ability for a forest to eventually return to a similar state. Now, we're not proposing it's going to stay the same because forests do change, but it has the ability to return to a similar state after a disturbance causes that short-term change. And what's sort of interesting, especially in our eastern deciduous forest, is that disturbances are frequent on the landscape, and those disturbances can be man-made and they can be natural. National Geographic a few years ago put together a article on tornadoes east of the Mississippi River, and they mapped all the tornadoes since 1950, and they made the statement that if tornadoes were evenly distributed in the eastern United States, and let me say that's a big if, tornadoes are not evenly distributed, but if they were evenly distributed, there would be a tornado on every acre east of the Mississippi River every 100 years. Now, when you start thinking about succession and how vegetation changes with succession, it's very difficult to find, quote, what a old growth area might be or a climax area in succession theory, because disturbances are frequent and disturbances tend to set succession back to an earlier stage. So we don't have that many old growth areas in the east, really because disturbances are rampant on the landscape. Where we do have some old growth type areas, they're going to be in protected areas from the weather. Gorges, stream valleys, perhaps, those type of situations. So a resilient forest usually has a diversity of species. We are blessed in the eastern United States, and especially where I'm at here in eastern Tennessee, that we're in a temperate region and we have a diversity of species. If you go out west, where you only have 4, 6, 8 different species, then diversity is not that great, but we have a species richness in Tennessee. Maintain vigorous trees. Trees that are growing well are less susceptible to disturbances. And as stands grow and develop, and once all that growing space is utilized, typically we have overstocking and growth slows and stagnation begins. And trees under those conditions become increasingly stressed. So overstocking and stress lead to trees not being very vigorous and not being able to maybe recover from disturbances or insect and disease impacts. In fact, stressed trees, non-vigorous trees, are typically more susceptible to insects and disease than ones that are more vigorous. Once you get to that closed canopy, and we'll talk about that, some type of thinnings probably need to be conducted to allow more growing space and resources, typically moisture, nutrients, and light, for the remaining trees to continue growing and remain healthy. Now, the good thing about also thinning these stands, which also enhances forest health, is typically thinnings take out the poorly formed, the unhealthy trees, perhaps trees of species that are not as desirable, and in doing that, you're promoting a more healthy forest. We wanted to avoid too many mature or over mature trees, and vice versa, too many young or regenerating trees. Now, typically with most stands, most forests, we have older forests and not as much younger forests. Older trees, just like older humans, are more susceptible to disturbances, to disease, insects. Older trees are less vigorous than younger trees and have less chance of overcoming the damage from a disturbance. The anomaly that I like to use, that is, let's say you're a teenager and you get the flu while you're a teenager, you get over it in a couple days. It's not a big problem. However, if you get the flu when you're 65, 70 years old, it takes much longer to get over the flu because you don't have that vigorous capacity anymore. Also, when you get to mature and over mature trees, again, going back to another anomaly, is older trees really do not produce that much progeny or seed to produce new trees. Typically, we encounter older trees and we start thinking, oh, we've got to preserve seed production or regeneration, but many of these trees have not been producing acorns, nuts, seeds, and so forth because they're just at the tail end of their life cycle. And I'd say humans are the same thing. Another anomaly to use is that we're not reproducing very often when we're in those older age classes. So often, and this is really the case with red oak, if you have an interest in red oak, one of my sayings is an oak is not an oak is not an oak, and we tend to think that red oak and white oak ought to be treated similarly. And that is not the case. Red oak has a much shorter life cycle than white oak. So if we're waiting too long to regenerate a stand of red oak, a lot of times that red oak may not be producing enough progeny to make it worthwhile. Red oaks live, depending on the species, scarlet oak a little shorter lived, northern red oak a little longer lived, but 80 to 100, maybe 120 years old. White oaks live to be much longer, and so we can wait on white oak, and they produce progeny over a much longer time span too. And then the other component that we can relieve as managers is density or overcrowding. Again, there's only so much growing space. And when trees start becoming tight or overcrowded, and the easy way to look at that from being in the field is any sunlight getting through the trees to the ground. If not, it's overcrowded, it's a very dense stand, and there's limited growing space. And with trees having limited growing space, they tend to slow down in growth and can become very easily stressed. So we're trying to look at, well, what kind of trees are we trying to grow? What are our future desires and objectives? And so in the stand in the left, this is a stand where yellow poplar is being left to provide mainly structure, because yellow poplar regenerates very readily from seed stored on the ground, to provide some vertical structure in a regenerating stand. And then the one on the right, even though it doesn't show it very well, this is something that's always been of interest to me, is this is oak and yellow poplar growing together. And typically poplar and oak don't grow all that well together, because poplar grows very fast and oak is slower. But if you're on one of those sites where it's a little less for less productivity for yellow poplar and a little better for red oak, you can grow these species together. And again, you have to be looking at the site productivity and how these species would tend to grow under these different conditions. So here's some common conditions that we find in hardwood stands. One of the typical problems we have, especially on private land, but it also occurs on public land, is that we don't have a lot of markets for small diameter trees. So we only enter the stand at longer age intervals, 25, 30 years, because our markets are mainly for saw timber, lumber, and so forth. Because of that, we're leaving stands alone for a long time, and in doing that, we are probably having aging and declining hardwood forests, trees that are mature and over-mature, and we're not perpetuating younger trees because we just don't enter the stand as often because of markets. We also have non-native invasive species, and we have a load of them now. We didn't have many years ago, but now they're just about everywhere, depending on where you are and the type of species that is there. I think I live in the Knoxville area, and I think Knoxville tends to be the overcapacity for invasive species. Species that are off-site or undesired, a lot of times trees will grow, at least initially, on sites that's probably not very conducive to them, but at the same time, moisture conditions are great for those species to grow. But once you get one of those droughts, those species are really off-site and they tend to succumb. So knowing what species will grow on the sites desired is important. And again, the one here is poplar. If you have good moisture, poplar will grow most anywhere, but it doesn't tolerate droughts very well. So when you have 2 or 3 years of excessive rainfall, and then you have a time like last year where we had a serious drought, poplar tends to fall out of the picture a little bit. Because we don't enter stands as often, we don't have as much mid-story we have an excessive amount of mid-story vegetation. We have a lot of excessive eels because we have not entered these stands very often. And then because of our markets, we tend to have high-graded stands, and typically there's not a lot of silviculture being practiced in high-graded stands. There's serious disregard for what those trees may turn into in the future, and then we're not meeting our goals of having a sustainable and a renewable stand that will be there for future generations. So how do we promote more stand resistance, especially when we have these events such as droughts and so forth? These are not secrets to anybody. When we get to an overstock condition, we need to thin stands, and so trees continue to grow vigorously. On some of our mediocre to poor sites, these stands used to harbor both mixed pine hardwood species. The pine has fallen out, maybe because of southern pine beetle or the longevity, or we just haven't really managed these stands. Pine is an intolerant species. It will only regenerate in full sunlight, and if you have a pure hardwood area, those species, pine will not perpetuate itself. So we're beginning to look at ideas of how to grow pine and hardwood together on sites that will provide that type of diversity. You want to minimize logging damage. You don't want to wait too long to harvest or regenerate mature and over-mature stands, really because of seed production and life cycle longevity. Control invasives. And then we're beginning to pay a lot of attention to climate variability. When I first came to Knoxville, I was sort of the person who talked about leaf color change. And leaf color change in Knoxville was the Alabama-Tennessee football game the third weekend in October. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, and that's been a while. Leaf color change is now the end of October or the 1st of November. So that gives you an indication. There are changes in climate. I like to call it variability more than change. So if you had to put it into a nutshell, what are we doing as forest managers? We're managing sunlight to match the light tolerance of the species that we're interested in, and typically our species that in most of our areas that we're interested in are going to be more shade intolerant. We're managing density. How many trees can you have per acre? And when trees are young, you can have many more trees, but when you get to maturity, you're only talking a few trees per acre. I'll have a table on that. And then we don't really deal with site productivity as far as improving site productivity or in that manner like we would in agriculture with fertilization and irrigation. But we have such a wide range of species that grow at different rates and grow on different sites. We need to make sure that we're growing the correct species to the site that will perpetuate those species. The easy example is black walnut. Everybody likes walnut because it's a high-value species. But you don't plant walnut on the ridge. It won't do well on the ridge. But if you're in a rich, moist, northern aspect situation, black walnut is a great species to plant. So in promoting stand resistance, this is a review of the factors that we look at. Thinning, stagnant, or low vigor stands. So this is an old field yellow poplar stand in the mountains at a high slope, and trying to you can just look at it and tell it's very dense, needs to be thinned. You notice underneath these trees there's very little vegetation on the ground because there's not a lot of sunlight that gets to the ground. So this is an example of a thinning operation where you can take out some of the smaller trees, the trees that are left behind, and provide growing space for the trees that are left. And again, in a hardwood forest, we tend to have overstocking and a lot of mid-story in these stands. And the mid-story doesn't allow us to regenerate these trees very well. So one of the treatments might be a mid-story removal that allows sunlight to get to the ground so you can start natural regeneration for your trees. Thinning basically is you're reducing the number of stems per acre, and you're doing that by altering the environment. You're trying to give more physical space and sunlight to the remaining trees, and so you're redistributing growth to a smaller number of trees, which increases the health, vigor, and growth of the stand. Being at the university, I have to show one graph, but every site, and this is looking at stands, not so much individual trees, there is some limit to carrying capacity, and the growth of the stand tries to reach carrying capacity or the maximum biomass. Now, if you look at the stand growth curve, notice that it's increasing at an increasing rate, almost at a 45-degree angle. And that's because there's nothing inhibiting those trees. They don't have competition. They don't have a lot of influence from adjacent trees. There's lots of growing space. However, where you see that first cut line right below the curve term there, notice that that curve has started now to, it's still increasing, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. The reason for that is now you're getting competitive effects. And so to release some of those trees, to make sure they continue to grow vigorously, a thinning or some type of an intermediate operation is needed to relieve growing space for the remaining trees. So you're going to cut some trees to produce larger trees. And in theory, you could probably thin several times. In application, we probably thin once or twice in a hardwood stand. But the idea is we're trying to put the growth on fewer trees so we get larger trees. So this is a back of the napkin idea here. Is it's supposed that all the trees on the acre were 6 inches. Now it doesn't happen that way, but just to show examples, let's suppose the whole acre is filled up with 6-inch trees. We'd have somewhere around 200, 300 trees per acre. And the reason for the range is different species have different crown forms. So if you were growing pine with a fairly narrow crown, or yellow poplar or sweet gum, you would have more trees. If you're growing something like oak and hickory where the crowns tend to spread, you'd have fewer trees. Now, if all the growing space is taken up by those 6-inch trees, how do trees get to 8 to 10 inches? Well, something happens. Mother Nature does a good job that some trees die because they don't have the resources, and the remaining trees will capture that new growing space, increase their growth, and thus become larger in diameter. And you'll see over in the second column that we have fewer trees per acre. When you get to a mature stand, let's say 18 or 20 inches, and if all these trees were evenly distributed, you could probably fit somewhere around 30 to 50 trees per acre. So what happens, what Mother Nature does over time, is we start out with lots of trees per acre, and we end up with somewhere around 30, 50 trees. It takes a long time for that to happen, for Mother Nature to do that. If we can select trees at an early age and thin, we can get to 18, 20 inches much quicker than we would by just letting nature take its course. When do we thin? We usually thin when it's closed canopied, so that's a good indication that sunlight is not getting through the crowns. When live crown ratios, that's the percentage of crown to the overall length of the tree, is less than 33%, i.e. we're growing tall, skinny trees, and we'd like to get some diameter to them. And then if you're looking at diameter growth rates, they will begin to decrease too. And what to thin, that really depends on your objectives, but just generally we tend to take out the unwanted trees, the poor form trees, the ones that are slow in growth. So we keep the more healthy, the more vigorous trees in the forest. Promoting mixed pine hardwood, and I alluded to that, but a lot of our stands back in the 40s and 50s were mixed pine hardwood, and then Smoky Bear Syndrome came along, we quit burning, so we quit regenerating natural pine, and most of them have moved on to become pure hardwood stands, but this is just an example of the diversity that you can have with pine and hardwood, especially on the mediocre to more xeric sites, is a very good way of creating diversity in your stands. And then one of my research examples is how do you get pine back into these hardwood stands? And again, these are transitional community types because it's very difficult to regenerate pine in a closed forest. So we're looking at things like cluster planting, or maybe after a complete regeneration cut of planting pine at a wide spacing, not like a plantation, but something like 12 by 12 to 18 by 18, and letting natural hardwood regeneration come up between the pine. Minimize logging damage, and we've had a lot of logging instances in the past. Fire would be another disturbing influence, that a lot of the trees that were growing are probably very poor trees. And again, turning those around, you can look in this instance on the plateau where we do have trees with buckswell, trees that have lots of branches and so forth, and these are trees, yeah, you might be able to get a cross tie out of them, but they're not very valuable. So trying to reduce damage, whether it's from logging or fire or insects and disease, is important. Regenerate over mature trees. So this gives you another example of, this is actually a shelter wood release, where we left some trees and then we cut the shelter wood off of it to release that regeneration. Give you some ideas, again, to start thinking about. We've got to start regenerating some of these forests. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a lot of red maple and a lot of shade-tolerant species. And this gives you an idea. This was actually an old field on a wildlife refuge 30 years ago. And you can see how dark we're not regenerating anything, and here is these mid-story tolerant species which aren't going to be future crop trees. So again, trying to think how we're going to regenerate these areas is something to think about. And then I want to spend the last part of this in controlling invasives. And this has gotten to be a part of what we're all interested in because it is changing our forests. Let's talk about a little bit on the definition. Any species, including seeds, eggs, spores, that's capable of propagating that species, that's not really native to that system, and whose introduction does or is likely to cause some type of harm to human health or ecosystem health. So when we start looking at impacts, they can affect biodiversity, they can affect ecosystem function, economies of scale, aesthetics, and human health. So we have examples of well-known invasives that have had impacts on the landscape: chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, and so forth. Now, you can take these numbers as a little bit, you can sort of, take them with a grain of salt, but they are published. And we have, somewhere around 7,000 exotic species. 600 species cause some form of ecological harm, and a lot of that is defining what ecological harm is. And in Tennessee, where I work, we have what the Native Plant Council determines as 152 threats in Tennessee, whether it's plants or insects or disease or animals along those lines. So you can see that they are increasing rapidly. Some of them that are major health issues: oak decline, gypsy moth, pine beetle. I know this is a hardwood talk, but pine beetle and hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer, thousand canker disease. These are some of the biggies. But we've got a lot of them out there that could be affecting you, whether it's a wood wasp or these beetles. Sudden oak death. I've always said in Tennessee we're an oak hickory forest. If we got oak decline and gypsy moth and sudden oak death all at the same time, I'm not sure what we would do. Kogon grass in the deep south, and then we'll talk a little bit about these plant species too. I actually was on a landowner's property a couple weeks ago where the whole understory was nandina. Didn't belong there. It just blew my mind how much nandina was there. So a lot of this comes from Dave Moorhead, who's a colleague and has worked with the Budwood site with the University of Georgia. Just to give you some of the wide variety of ideas here of how invasive species got here. Packing material, this is microstegium, some crop containment type issues. They get here from a lot of different places. Some of them are intentionally introduced, like mimosa, or for wildlife introductions, wildlife food plots, lespedeza, autumn olive, those type of things. And then some were really put out for erosion control, vetch and kudzu. So it gives you an idea. They just didn't hit here by themselves, but they have exploded without management. And typically with an invasive species, you don't notice it very much, and then over the next 15, 20 years, they tend to explode as they get established and be able to reproduce. So, again, this is for the southern states. Again, estimates. To give you an idea, we've always had honeysuckle, but privets are really something now. They're green throughout the year. They produce a berry that's moved around by birds. Japanese stilt grass, non-native roses, all those going down the line, and I could add a whole lot more to that. 18 million acres occupied by 33 taxa, and estimates are, about 10% of our forested acres in the south have invasive species. And these invasive species are displacing native species. They can cause other problems when we're thinking about perpetuating, regenerating, managing forests. Typically, these invasive species like disturbed areas, and when we manage forests through silviculture, we're disturbing the forest. But typical areas include these: roadsides, ditches, cut-over forests, fields, pastures, old fields, right-of-ways. A lot of our prescribed burning creates some of these habitats for invasive species, as well as our silviculture. So what can we do about it? I would suggest that you go to any of these websites and invasive species. They're very good, but we got to learn to identify them. We got to learn how they respond to disturbances. Think about controlling them before they get too large, and not to plant or use invasive species. Again, I had a father-in-law who traveled abroad after he retired, and he would love to bring seeds back from wherever he was traveling and plant them in his backyard. It sounds very innocent, but again, this is where things begin to grow, populate, and perhaps regenerate, and so forth. Talk to him about it. That didn't seem to influence him much. Wisteria, one example, and this is just going to be a whole bunch of slides from the Bugwood site to give you some ideas just of the variety of species that we have. Honeysuckle, privet, kudzu, mimosa, Japanese climbing fern, tree of heaven. We have tree of heaven explosion now that we deal with just about every day, and it's a very unique species because it seeds within 3 years, and it spreads by root sprouts. So you got to control the sprouting and the seeds, and not an easy plant to control. A lot of herbicides work well on tree of heaven, but you got to actually do the applications. Bamboo, tallow tree, popcorn tree, English ivy. Look at that picnic area on the edge of the woods. Nepalese brown top, Japanese stilt grass. This is one of our research areas with Nepalese brown top after it is pulled seedlings over. Miscanthus, Kogon grass. Georgia has a whole program on Kogon grass. And then you look at these areas, and again, road cuts are a good place to look for a lot of these invasive species. Greenways, these type of environments. Here you got many different species all together. And how would you go about in a integrated pest program to control all these different species? Gets to be mind-boggling. Silvicultural practices are harvesting, road construction, site prep, tree planting. All these are all disturbances that can encourage invasive species. So it's something we need to be aware of. And typically your IPM programs are looking at prevention. That's the best thing, is try to prevent it. But if you detect it and have it monitored and control it while you can, a lot of that, then you have to get into restoration programs. Research and education are fundamental. And then your methods for control. I watch people over in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, because they're not supposed to use chemicals over there, and they hand pull mimosa plants. That's fine, gets rid of mimosa at that time, but it doesn't take care of the root system. They resprout. And the next set of folks over there, summer help, are pulling up more mimosa plants. Mechanical, you can do things manually, but typically you're leaving roots, and roots keep on perpetuating and sprouting. Chemical, if used correctly, translocates chemicals to the root system to kill the root system so that you do not have resprouting and so forth. Biological control, and then a lot of folks are thinking about prescribed burning, but that kills the top, but not necessarily the root system. So we have a variety of different species, different methods. You have to figure out what works well with the species that you're trying to control. And I would also encourage folks, control a little now while it doesn't cost very much, because once an invasive explodes, you're talking big money to try to control populations. So here's your typical hardwood forest. This is one that has not been entered in 40 years. And just think, we got big mature oaks, we got lots of mid-story, we don't have a lot of regeneration. The type of regeneration we have is shade tolerant. So how do we go into these areas to think about what are the species that we wish to carry? Oaks are always problematic because they're intermediate in light tolerance. If you open it up too much, you're going to get shade intolerant species. If you don't open it up enough, you're going to get shade tolerant species, maple, beech, sourwood, those type things. So finding that line to perpetuate some of the species that we're very interested in is difficult at times. So here's take-home messages. Manage your forests. And most of this is prevention through management. Typically, you don't want decadent trees. You don't want trees that are not very vigorous, that are stagnated. Get in and create enough growing space for these trees to grow. You want a diversity of species because of, and that's usually not a problem in eastern forests. We probably has a much richness of species in the eastern forests than anywhere else besides the tropical rainforest, whether up in Washington area, Alaska, or getting down into the tropics. So again, we've always encouraged a diversity of species because typically insects and disease is species oriented. They like one species. They don't like all species. So when you have a diversity of species, you won't have a complete breakdown. Active management, maintaining vigorous trees, avoiding mature to overmature older trees. Now, it's good to have some of those, but you don't want large acreages in that condition. And then controlling density and overcrowding to provide growing space so trees can maintain that vigor. And then control invasives. And that is becoming more important all the time with the explosion that we've had with invasives. So typically, and this is a very general statement, that good forest management and maintaining vigorous trees encourages a healthy forest. Our problem is we don't enter forest very much to keep those trees vigorous. And so the challenge is not to allow these forest conditions that increase the susceptibility to insects and disease and pollination and spread of invasive plants and factors that may perpetuate forest decline. So the bottom line here is manage your forests and don't allow closed canopies. Make sure you have enough growing space for the trees so they can maintain a vigorous condition. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to entertain any thoughts or questions or so forth. All
right. Thank you, Dr. Clatterbuck. So it looks like we have one question, or sort of comment/question. And if anybody wants to ask any questions right now, we're going to wait around just a little bit, and we're going to let people type them into the chat box. So the first one is from Jack Meyer. Would you agree that there is some bias in the forestry community when trees way below half their maximal age are commonly called overmature?
Well, I think the question is, a lot of it's in semantics and what you consider a viable lifespan and what is a potential lifespan. So, you know, yellow poplar will live to be 400 years old. I don't think we're managing poplar to be 400 years old. The viability of a poplar in a forested situation is probably much less than that. So in doing those type things, we tend to get caught up in what is a maximum age, how do you define overmature. What I would rather do is try to say, are we keeping vigorous trees on the landscape that have the ability to continue to grow and reproduce and set forth new generations? And that's going to differ by species. and so forth. But on the better sites, you're going to get longer ages. On the poorer sites where there's more environmental stress and so forth, probably the longevity is not going to be that great. I hope that answers your question.
I guess Kurt Svitek has a comment. There's also a difference between biological maturity and commercial maturity, which I think you kind of were addressing, Dr. Clutterbuck.
Yes, that's definitely true. So, I'm a tree hugger like anybody else. I love trees. But at the same time, you got to figure out within the ecosystem that you're working with, and there's good reasons to have mature and over-mature trees on the landscape. My question is, in the way that we have sort of let unmanaged situations perpetuate, is how much of that is necessary. I think we need some. That's why we have national parks and we have wilderness areas. But at the same time, trying to figure out where we are. And I worked up in southern Indiana where there's a place up there that is more or less left alone, and it's creating a pretty neat situation from a biological standpoint that all these older trees, and some of them are cherry and walnut, are beginning to fall out. The crowns are breaking up. That's fine, but there is new regeneration coming up. It's not cherry or walnut. It happens to be poplar. And so if we're trying to manage what type of species are on the site, we have to pay attention to what we're trying to do.
All right. Dwayne Means has another question. So do you know of any studies following the rate of increase in invasives with increase in forest fragmentation due to the disturbances of gas drilling and pipeline construction?
I don't know anything that specific. I can tell you, though, with pipeline, you can almost, sort of put in the same question, pipeline construction to construction of roads. You have different habitats where you're going to have edge, you're going to have open area, and I would think it would be very similar to the construction of roads. One species that I find very interesting, and this is just a sidelight, would be an invasive, well, a lot of people consider invasive. I don't think it's all that invasive. It is exotic, is Royal Polonia. And where that tree grows and where the seed germinates is basically on sterile soil that is been as a result from burning or as a result of road cuts. You very rarely see Royal Polonia out in the middle of a field in a pasture or fescue area or in the deep forest, because the seed is very susceptible to damping off and the bacteria and so forth that are in resident soil. So when you start disturbing and putting in road cuts, pipelines, moving soil around and that type thing, that's probably going to introduce a new suite of species, and it's a place where invasives can come in. But to answer your question, I think pipelines would be very similar to roads to some degree.
All right. Hopefully, it seems like that answers that question, at least somewhat. And what is the current state and outlook of research on American chestnut blight resistance and reestablishment? This is from Carl Schattenberg.
Well, you're probably going to get into my biases a little bit. There's been quite a bit of work done with American chestnut. I think there's still quite a bit of work to do. We're getting to the point where claims are being made that we're 15/16 closer for chestnut and so forth, but that has not really resulted in outplantings where American chestnut has survived. So I think there's more work to do on that. The other question that's going to be really interesting is within this ecosystem basis is what type of habitats and what type of management is American chestnut really survive, but not only survive but grow well on. And we're far enough down the road from the blight that we don't really know the landscapes, the site conditions, the soils, the competition effects, and how that affects chestnuts. So there is some work that the Forest Service is doing and others to see how, once we got chestnuts that we feel that are going to survive the blight and so forth, how will they, get back into a natural environment and work with other species under current conditions. Because I think we can all say the environment is different today than it was in the 1920s.
All right. Our next question is from Brian Bradley. Any thoughts on the 2014 study published in Nature that states older trees are growing faster and storing more carbon as they age?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the article. Older trees can still grow, and they can still be a carbon sink and that type thing. The question is again in relation to what you're comparing it to. So let's say we got 3 old trees that are sequestering carbon and so forth. How does that compare to, let's say, 10 smaller trees that may take up the same area? I don't know. I think trees are wonderful. They're renewable. They're sustainable. They sequester carbon and so forth. But to make the relation that old trees are better than young trees, or mid-rotation or mid-age trees are better than that or the other, that has to be qualified a little bit. The trees are going to continue to sequester carbon, and especially ones that are long-lived. They got lots of biomass. They got lots of large crowns. So, and again, the question is, what is growing is another question. How is growth determined? Is it strictly a diameter of the tree? Are we looking at crown span? All those type things. It gets to be a little interesting when you start making comparisons to make sure that you're comparing apples and apples or apples to oranges.
All right. Another question from Phil Hutton. Do you have any experiences with the American chestnut engineered with wheat defense genes?
No, I know very little. In fact, I know nothing about that. So, sorry about that.
All right. Another chestnut question by Carl Schattenberg. A chestnut species thrives in parts of Europe, and would these chestnuts be adaptable and useful in reestablishment of a chestnut species in North America?
Well, I think that's definitely true. We have Japanese chestnut and Chinese chestnut, and they're not as susceptible to the blight. They don't have the tree characteristics, whether you're looking that our Native American chestnut had. I'm not all that familiar with European chestnut. It may have characters that can be used. I would think that someone has looked at that. I'm not familiar with it. I've been to Europe once, and I look at the European beech tree, which is a fabulous tree in Europe. In fact, they're trying to replace the non-native black forest with European beech over a time period. It is completely opposite than our American beech, and I've always wondered if we brought European beech over here, how would it act? And again, you're dealing with native versus non-native and how those systems work, and you have to be careful when you start introducing new species and figuring out how they're going to react to this environment and with other species.
All right. Let me take a look at the participants and see if anybody else is typing something. All right, we got one more person typing something, it looks like. So we're going to wait just a second, and I'm actually going to put out the link y'all are going to need in order to get CEU credits for this webinar. So that will be coming up soon.
I just want to say I appreciate everybody taking time out today. Hopefully, I may not have let you know a whole lot of what you already know, but it may have instigated some thoughts that will give you some food for thought in the future. Forest health is something that's going to be intertwined with looking at climate variability, how species are going to change, and there's always a temporal aspect to this, and it's always interesting if you're in agriculture, you think on 1 year intervals. On forest, we're thinking much longer intervals, and there's a lot more different factors or risks or even positive things that can come out of that. So hopefully I've instigated some thoughts and perhaps some knowledge that you all can look at and capitulate on.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Clatterbuck, for the webinar. We already have some people thanking you, and including Carlin and Emmanuel, Lisa Denise, and George Wake. You know, again, it was great, and this webinar will actually be available within about a week for on-demand download at forestrywebinars.net in the on-demand section. So if anybody wants to recommend it to somebody else, somebody can you know, watch it in the weeks to come and still get CEU credits for about a year afterwards. And if anybody has any sort of problem with getting CEUs because they were dropped from the webinar, email me, Brent Peterson. I'm actually going to put my email in the chat box right now, and I will try to get you set up. Sometimes that can be a problem. But otherwise, thank you all for your attendance and your questions. And hopefully we'll see you. And, you know, specifically, Dr. David Coyle, who's the actual coordinator of the Southern Forest Health Program, will see you when the webinars start up again in the spring, so in the new year. Have anything else to say before we wrap up, Dr. Clatterbuck?
Nope, you've got it all.
All right. If you want to see other webinars that we've done at the Southern Forest Health Program, you can also go to southernforesthealth.net/webinars. I'm going to remain on the line here as everybody logs off, just in order to take questions if people have problems with the CEUs or, you know, whatever, rating the webinar. Dr. Clatterbuck, you can leave whenever you'd like, or, you know, if you want, you can hang out here, but okay. I'm sure you have better things to do with your time.
Well, I'm supposed to be in West Tennessee for an 8 o'clock session in the morning, so I'll probably sign off. One thing I wanted to let you know that I forgot about is I need to turn off my email when you do this, because all the ringing was my email coming in, and I don't know if that was transmitted or not. And so I just, you know, closed out my email and it was fine. But I don't know if any of that was transmitted early on when bells and whistles come on when a new email is showed up.
I think you know, the distraction was minimal if there was any. Okay.
So I did it within the first 5 minutes, I think, but I realized what was going on. I didn't know if it was being transmitted or not. So maybe the sound was. Maybe you heard a bell every once in a while.
All right. Again, I'll be staying on for a little bit, but feel free to leave, everybody, and hope to see you guys on the next webinar, either probably January or February.